For today couldn't be better time. It's perfect timing for us pastors. You see, this is October, and in most congregations we are now getting the budgets ready for next year, and we're developing the pledges for next year and asking people to consider what they're going to give. And up comes this text about money. Perfect timing. And there is no doubt about it. This text is about money and wealth and the relationship to God. But we're not going to talk about that today. Although we could. We're a small group of people. It's a new mission. And we always have to ask ourselves, to what extent are we going to be self-supporting? What extent are we going to give our wealth, how large or small it is, to God? But I think there's an overriding indication in this text. And that's why, if you notice, when we read the text, it said Jesus was on the way. I changed the translation. And the reason is that on the way to the author was great significance to the people of that time. First of all, at the time of the early church, as recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, they were called the people of the way. They were called the people who followed Jesus, and therefore they were the people of that way and Jesus. And if you read the Gospel of Mark in its entirety, you will find beginning in chapter 8, after the Transfiguration, or in chapter 9, he is now moving toward Jerusalem. He is on the way. He is on the way to the cross. He is on the way to the crucifixion. And he is now spending time in this section of talking with his disciples about what it means to be on the way with Jesus. And we've heard that somewhat the last 3 weeks. So this week, as he begins on the way, this rich man comes up to him and kneels before him, which has one of two or both meanings. First of all, he acknowledges Jesus' authority, even though he's rich. Secondly, he could be asking for healing, because in the Gospel of Mark, people knelt in order to be healed. And he wants to know something. He wants to know how he can inherit eternal life. Well, if you know anything about inheritance, there's not a dang thing you can do about it. The person who's got the wealth makes that choice. You have nothing to do with it. I don't know how many cases I've heard about people who have really gone out of their way to help somebody, and at the end, when the person dies, they're left out of the will. God's got the wealth, the kind of wealth we're looking for, and there's not a thing we can do about it. But he lists those last 4 or 5 commandments. Do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not bear false witness, honor your mother and father. And he adds something that are not in the other text. Do not defraud. And that's interesting. Because you see, at that time in the culture, the belief was the pie of wealth was limited. There was only so much. And so if you were going to get wealthy, you had to take it from somebody else. And many times you did that by defraud. And so Jesus might have perceived how this wealthy man got some of his wealth. But then he hits the shocker to him. Well, that's fine. But if you want eternal life, if you want the reign of God, then what you got to do is get rid of everything and follow me. Be on my way. And he says that to us. Now, we may not be wealthy, but I'll bet you each one of us could identify things or wealth or whatever that keep us from following Jesus on the way, because this culture and the material goods and everything that goes with it directs us in another direction and gives us our attention. That's what happened to Jacob. He was on the way. He was Mama's boy. He was Rebecca's little boy. He was frail. He was kind of effeminate, you might call. And Esau, his twin brother, who was born first, therefore had the inheritance, was the macho guy. Hairy, went out and hunted, did all those kind of things men were supposed to do, and he was Isaac's boy. But he came back from one of his field trips, hungry, famished, and Jacob took advantage of it. That's how you defraud people, isn't it? And he said, yeah, I'll give you something to eat if you sell me your birthright. Well, Esau, thinking only of himself, said, what good is a birthright to me? And sold it. Jacob went on later, through the encouragement of his mother Rebekah, to become like Esau and get the blessing of Esau from Isaac, without Isaac knowing, because Isaac was blind. Esau found out about it, was going to kill Jacob, and Jacob went back to his mother's family. And for 14 years, he was defrauded. But he ended up marrying Leah and Rachel. They each had a maid, and they ended up having 11 children. Benjamin wasn't born until later. And he's on his way back home again, and he knows he probably has to face Esau. And he's probably scared out of his wits. And so he sends the whole entourage ahead when they cross the ford of the Jabbok, and he's alone. And he wrestles with God. And God humbles him. Jacob finds out who's in charge. And because of that, and to remind him, Jacob limps for the rest of his life. You see, he was on his way, and he met God. So both Jacob was confronted with God, and this rich man was confronted with God through Jesus, and so things were never the same. I'd like to share a story with you, a personal story of mine. Back in Florence, when I was the minister there was a young couple, about 21, 22, and they were going to get married. The bride's parents and grandparents went to the church. And so we went through the normal thing of premarital counseling. And in the midst of all of that, I heard from more than one, several members of the family, she had 2 sisters, that the groom had a problem drinking. And after I'd heard that for a while, I asked if I could visit with them, not saying what I wanted to share, at the parsonage. And they came to visit. And I asked them about that. Well, the groom-to-be said, you know, that's just young people. You know, I'm sowing my wild oats. I didn't surprise me that he took that attitude. But then what scared me? The bride said, don't worry about it, Pastor. I can control it. And that made me nervous. So I talked to some mentors and ended up calling a meeting of the parents of both the bride and the groom themselves. And we all got together, and after we sat down, I said, there's an elephant in this room, and we need to name it. Chris, you have a problem drinking. And of course he went through the same thing, and his parents, just like Rebecca, just took his defense and everything, and they all kind of talked around it and whatever. But I married her. And see, I had a concern because I, as a pastor, need to discern whether or not they should be married. I never saw him again. He was rather upset with me. So was the bride. However, a little bit later I found out he was so wasted the day before the wedding that he almost couldn't make it in the wedding. And about 6 years later, he entered a 12-step program. I shared that with a friend of mine, and that friend said, you know what happened, Ed? You confronted him, and for the rest of the time, he could not drink the same because the word was out. Everybody knew. And that's what Jesus can do to us if we let Jesus. If we break open our heart and we let Jesus confront us and we say, Jesus, what do I need to do to be on the way with you? And Jesus would say, give up everything that's important and follow me. Now, the rich man, if we read the story, most people will say he grieved because he couldn't do it. That doesn't say that. It just says he grieved. Now, he could have grieved because of that. He could have grieved because he knew he had to give up the wealth, and loss always produces grief. Or he knew that the struggle he had ahead would cause him a lot of pain if he followed Jesus, if he went on the way with Jesus. And so it is with us. First of all, we can be like the guy who is the groom. We can just deny it. We can say, oh yeah, we're Christians. We go to church every Sunday. You know, we believe in Jesus, all that kind of stuff. And the thing we need to remember, even through that, and I'm not trying to say you got to do a certain way. Remember always, in that text, Jesus said, he loved us. He loves us no matter what. But we can decide whether or not we'll struggle with our relationship with Christ as we walk on the way with him, knowing the pain, knowing the discomfort we have as we walk along the way, but also knowing he loves us and is with us. For you see, there are the fruits of them. We will experience the reign of God. And we will have eternal life. Now and forever.